Just to start with, the definition of learning outcomes as we use in the European context, it's very simple. It's learning outcome is a statement of what a learner knows, understands, or is able to do following the completion of a learning process. So, of course, this is a simple definition, but it's also a very consequential definition because it draws the attention to the individual and what the individual, the learner, is supposed to, is expected, actually has understood, is able to do and know. So the focus, instead of focusing on what we teach, what kind of books we read, we focus actually on the learning process and the implications and the impact this learning process has on the individual. So the definition is important, and I just sort of say, want to stress that this definition and its kind of focusing on the individual has a lot of implications, which I will try to address throughout my speech. So you can shift to the next slide. Yeah, and this is also in a way about the definition, because I think sometimes we overlook the fact that we are talking about two types of learning outcomes. We are speaking about the intended learning outcomes, the ones we find in curricula, the ones we find in education programs, to some extent also what is expressed in level descriptors. It's about a statement what a learner is expected to know, to be able to do and understand following a process. So the intention, of course, this is very important, because when we write curricula, when we set standard, this is really what it is about. But of course, when we then assess the individual, when we look at the ability of this person to actually carry out a piece of work, to do a task, then of course we speak about the achieved learning outcomes. What kind of knowledge, what kind of skills, what kind of competences are actually now held by these individuals. So it's very important to keep this in mind, and there is always a kind of a feedback loop between the intended learning outcomes as we define them in curricula, for example, in programs, and the actual learning outcomes as we see them in practice as held by the individuals. And I think when we speak about using learning outcomes to define qualifications, to orient education program, this feedback loop between the intentions and the actual outcomes is really essential. We have been doing quite a lot of research on that, and also on the national and system and also European level. How can we improve this kind of feedback loop between the intentions and the actually achieved learning outcomes? So just as a very important kind of statement at the very beginning. You can move to the next slide. So I would like to say something about learning outcomes in the European education training policies. And if you look back historically, national efforts to implement learning outcomes can be traced systematically back to the 1980s. I mean, that is when we see that this context is really gaining ground. And of course, it's not only kind of full agreement, there's a lot of tensions and discussions related to this. If you look at the European Union policies, this principle is being kind of introduced explicitly and systematically from the turn of the century, around 2000, when it comes into the picture. And the European qualification framework, where we started work around 2003, 2004, has, I would say, played a key role in promoting the principle of learning outcomes, not only for the qualification framework, but as a principle which, so to say, feeds into the way we define programs, the way we orient curricula, education, and training. So in a way, what I would say is that the learning outcomes principle, in a way, it's sort of a glue. It's a sort of a connector binding together different European policies on skills, on qualifications. It's a kind of common reference point, because if we are not able to orient our policies, be that at the system level, the way we support individuals, if you are not able to address what they are supposed to expected to know, be able to do and understand, well, I mean, then we are, so to say, not doing our job. So in a way, there has been a very clear and explicit focus on learning outcomes now for quite some time, both at national and the kind of EU level. So you can change to the next slide, please. I think what is important here is to say that in a way, there are different purposes for using learning outcomes, and I think we need to keep that in mind. The overall purpose is, of course, it has to do with reforming, modernizing education and training, and the relationship between education, training, and the labor market. I think that is an overall to actually make the education training system, both for initial training, but increasingly for lifelong learning, to be better suited to serve individuals, but also to bridge between the education systems and the labor market. We have in our analysis perhaps looked at three main levels. It's, of course, the way learning outcomes influence the overall national European policies. We've also been looking at how learning outcomes can influence the management of institutions, education training institutions, but also other institutions. And finally, and that's important, how learning outcomes can actually influence pedagogical reform, how it supports, how it facilitates the learning process. I will quickly take you through some of these, so you can move to the next slide, please. So, learning outcomes in national European policies. There's a lot of aspirations, I would say, and you will know, certainly you will know some of these. I think learning outcomes, first of all, facilitates the valuing of all kind of learning, including the learning which takes place outside formal education training, outside the classroom, at work, in leisure time activities, and so on. Learning outcomes are also critical to increase the transparency of qualifications for learners and employers and for others to see, well, what is the content, what is the profile of a qualification, or what is the profile of the learning which is held by an individual in form of by having, let's say, completed a program or a qualification. Learning outcomes are also very important to facilitate progress. And I think this links, of course, to lifelong learning, because learning outcomes is about having kind of compatible ways to kind of capture what's the content. Can you accumulate, can you combine learning from different institutions, sectors, perhaps even countries? Can you build on them? Can you accumulate? Can you stack them in a way? And without the learning outcomes, without, in a way, kind of clarifying what's the knowledge, what's the skills, and so on, it's very difficult to do that, because then you are speaking about different institutions, different kind of input factors, which are very hard to compare. So for progress, this is important. Some also speak about the accountability of education training providers to really see what is being provided. Comparability is, of course, important in a context like we are speaking here today, to understand what's the similarities, differences between different countries. And all of this, in a way, brings us to the issue of lifelong, and I would add life-wide learning, because learning throughout life, but also learning across different institutions, different sectors, branches, and also in some cases across different countries. So these are very important aspirations and things we have been working on. Can we use the learning outcomes shift in order to strengthen our policies, our instruments in these areas? So you can shift to the next slide, please. I would say that if you look at learning outcomes, and then we are moving from the kind of overall policy levels to the more management and the aspirations there. Learning outcomes allows, at least that's the aspiration, a combination of strategic steering, what is the orientation of a program, a qualification, education training system, and a certain local autonomy. Because in a way, when you state a set of learning outcomes, you state, well, what should be the end product, so to say, what should be the learning which should be completed. The way you prepare that, what kind of pedagogies, what kind of teaching training is more open in a way and could be left to the local to see teachers, trainers, what is possible. So this kind of combination of strategic orientation, yes, there is a direction we go, but there is also a room for local autonomy. I think that is quite important. I think what we've seen is that the shift to learning outcomes in some cases allow for more consistent design of programs in where you have a common reference point. And it also forms an important part of quality assurance. And I think what is also important to say is that, of course, learning outcomes and learning outcomes approaches are sometimes criticized for this, that it is linked to other kind of management traditions like management by objectives and new public management. But as I would come back to later, this is not so, it's a little bit simplistic, and I will come back to that. I think the final set of aspiration, and that's the third level, is important here, and that has to do with the pedagogical reform. I think now I got the translation into my ear. So, yeah. As regards the pedagogical, and then we are getting closer to the individuals, I think the learning outcomes are important as they are helping to clarify the intention of the teaching and learning process. What is expected from the learner, you have to write that into the programs and the curricula. And I think it's a way of facilitating potentially a more consistent alignment of teaching, learning and assessment, and of better design of teaching and learning methods. And I think what is important, and that's what I started with, is that it really facilitates a more learner-centered process. So these are kind of aspirations. I mean, and I underline the term aspirations. This does not mean that in the European context, the last 20, let's say 30 years, these aspirations has been fulfilled. And I will gradually come to some of the challenges and tensions and so to say, yeah, problems linked to that. But we can then move to the next slide, please. Yeah, just a bit of a kind of a commentary in a way. What is the basis of what I'm speaking a bit here? CEDEFOP has been carrying out studies very regularly to look at the shift to learning outcomes. What is actually happening? There's basically three main studies, and you can download them from our website. There's a study from 2009, there's one from 2016, and there's one recently published in 2020, where we have looked very systematically at this shift. And I think these three studies show that there is a gradually reorientation of European education training policies at the overall policy level, not least due to the qualification framework, but also the way learning outcomes influence programs, curricula, and also then to some extent influence the management of institutions, but also, of course, the pedagogical practices. And I will just quickly take you through some of our observations regarding these things. I don't want to use too much time on it, but I will at least give you a glimpse into this. So you can change to the next slide. First of all, I want to focus a little bit about the different sectors of education and training. As you know, the European qualification framework is a comprehensive framework. It covers all levels of qualification, all types of qualification, which I think is also the aspiration of the African continental qualification framework. But if you look at the different sectors and how they have kind of taken up learning outcomes, if you start with the vocational education and training, or TVET, as many of you would say, we see that the learning outcomes approach is well established in European vocational education training. I think that's been traditionally the focus on competences, the focus on practice-based learning. You always have needed to be clear about what kind of knowledge, what kind of skills should actually be the result after a learning process. So I would say that almost all countries are now referring to learning outcomes, or some use the term competences, as fundamental to vocational education training, the way it is defined, the way it is oriented, the way it's reviewed and renewed. So in a way, what has happened in the last 2 decades is perhaps that the learning outcomes has become more explicit and a visible building block for VET. So I think that increases the transparency, it helps, it's a possibility to improve relevance, and it is a way to really put the learner at the center of the process. There is still quite a lot of work going on to build on what has been achieved, but I think the vocational education training sector is perhaps where we find the most kind of refined use of learning outcomes currently. You can move to the next. In higher education, when we did our study back in 2000, and the one published in 2009, the situation was in a way very mixed. Some higher education institutions certainly used learning outcomes, but many did not. What we saw then, interestingly, in the years from 2010 and let's say to 2016, when we published our next study, was a remarkable shift and a much stronger focus on learning outcomes. So what the reasons for this is, but of course you have the Bologna process, you have the EQF, you have a increased focus on learning outcomes, so meaning that many institutions, many countries explicitly start to revise their programs in terms of learning outcomes. So higher education clearly, in a way, is perhaps more in line now with vocational education training in using learning outcomes in a systematic and explicit way. The next slide, please. And that is linked to primary and general education. A little bit the same as higher education. We saw a shift taking place in the last decade. We see now a revision of national and core curricula. We see an increased focus on key competences, transversal skills and competences. We see also the impact of international assessments like PISA. And if we look at, for example, general upper secondary education, in the early studies of us, learning outcomes was not very, very prominent. This has changed in a way. So empirically speaking, if we look at 2 decades, there has been a change, a transition of European education training more explicitly, systematically using learning outcomes. So you can change to the next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. So then we can go from perhaps gradually moving from aspirations via kind of observation, what's happening in different sectors. We're now moving more into the actual policy impact. And I think the key drivers of change for this kind of transition I've been speaking about is certainly the comprehensive qualification framework. The EQF has played a role, but of course, more importantly, the fact that the EQF triggered the implementation, development of comprehensive qualification frameworks in all European countries. All the European countries now have these qualification frameworks, and that gives a very strong focus on the learning outcomes and how they influence program definitions, curriculum development, they influence assessment. I would also say, and that's perhaps important also for your discussion, that the introduction of systems for validation or recognition of prior learning, non-formal, informal learning certainly play a role in this, because it brings the focus over to what people actually have learned, irrespective of the context where they're learning. And in order to capture that, in order to assess that, it's very important that you have reference points, standards, curricula, which actually open up for this kind of learning outcome. So I would just kind of point to these developments, which have been there's been extensive development, I would say, in most countries, both on the frameworks, but also on the validation or recognition of prior learning area. So what kind of deeper impact do we see? And I think, first of all, what we see is more complete and accessible maps of qualification. That's been a direct result, that the shift to learning outcomes through the qualification frameworks have given us more complete qualification maps. This is now increasingly be strengthened by the fact that we get national databases linked at European level, which contain descriptions of the learning outcomes in each program, in each qualification, so that you gradually, or individuals gradually, are able to actually click on qualification and see, well, what is the profile? Not only the level, but also the content, the profile of qualification. We are currently having a working group at European level to develop, in a way, short descriptions of learning outcomes to be shared across the countries and across the different qualification levels and systems. What is interesting to see is also the systemic reforms which is happening, in particular in the area of higher vocational education training, AQF 5 to 8. We see that the learning outcomes and qualification frameworks actually open up or shows in a way the important higher level vocational qualifications which is taking place. And several countries now have introduced higher VET at level 5, at level 6, even level 7 and 8. You see the recent German reforms in that direction are quite interesting, and also saying that a higher VET qualification, for example, a master craftsman qualification in Germany, is put at the same level as a university bachelor, indicating that these are different qualifications, yes, but in terms of the level, the sophistication of the learning outcomes, these can be actually put at the same level, which in a way is a sort of a revolution in thinking. Higher education is not anymore the kind of monopoly of universities. It's also something which is the ownership of vocational education training programs. So, and of course, the comparability is something which follows from this. So we can go to the next slide, please. What about the management level? We can observe an impact of learning outcomes at curriculum and program design level. We see some strengthening of institution overview following learning outcomes. We have to admit that many institutions see learning outcomes as an ambiguous steering instrument. It opens up a space for dialogue, but it's not given in many cases how this space should be used. There's limited research on this. We don't really have the overview on how the learning outcomes can support institutions in taking forward or modernizing their programs. But this, I think, is an important area to touch later. You can go to the next slide, please. And that's the pedagogical in a way. Again, I would say, of course, there's a lot of research on pedagogies and learning methods and facilitation of learning, but relatively little on how the learning outcomes actually influences this. What I would emphasize is that the shift to learning outcomes, as I've described so far, does not by default lead to a change in the teaching and learning processes. A shift may create a space for change, but implies alignment between three factors: the definition of the intended learning outcomes, how this is done, it's the choice of teaching and learning methodology and approaches, and is of course also the engagement of students and learners, and I would say also teachers, that the motivation here is quite important. So I think in this area, we shouldn't take things for granted. Learning outcomes can, but it does not automatically trigger change in this area. I mean, this is probably no news to you, but I think it's important to emphasize, because we, in a way, working with qualification framework, look at the kind of the macro level of policy development institutions, but in the end, these kind of system level changes need to kind of trickle down to this level of teaching and learning. And the question is what it does. And I think we still have quite some way to go to see how can we use the potential of learning outcomes for this. So that's about the pedagogical impact. You can now go to the next. So in a way, to draw some conclusions about this so to say, travel through the developments, learning outcomes orient learning outcomes. They should not contain or restrict it. Learning outcomes statements should not be understood as preventing learners to go beyond minimum expectation, and learning outcome statements should assist teachers. And it's a question for the pedagogical area to find the balance between the prescriptive and the descriptive. But I will come back to that in the very final comments in a way, because we see you cannot take it for granted, but we also see there are some important principles to address when we are speaking about using learning outcomes at a level of the learners in terms of promoting teaching and learning. You can move to the next slide, please. And that is then leading me to the final part of my speech here. And these are about the key lessons we have drawn from learning outcomes. There is this handbook on learning outcomes we published in 2017. We are currently working on an update of that, but I think the slides I'm now presenting to you in a way kind of concentrate some of the key messages. The first one is alignment, because the success of learning outcomes depends on an alignment between learning outcomes written for qualification frameworks. How do they influence, or are they influenced by occupation standard, by the education training standards, the curricula, the teaching training, assessment requirements? So in a way, we could say that, well, we develop a qualification framework, be that African, continental, European Union in a way, and we focus on that. But that would risk in a way to leave the learning outcomes as kind of isolated statements, which are not in a dialogue and not intervening with the important, the actual, so to say, education, training, learning process. And this alignment and the dialogue between these different purposes, these different areas where learning outcomes are used is really essential and, of course, very challenging. But the qualification framework can give an inspiration. It can trigger development use, more systematic use of learning outcomes for different purposes. And I think that is what we're speaking of. So the alignment is the first thing. You can then take the next slide. Theory matters, and the writing of learning outcomes operates in a tension between schools of thought. And I think it's interesting to draw attention to this. It's sometimes said that we have one is a sort of a behavioristic tradition which emphasizes learning outcomes as certainly result-oriented. I think that is a general point, but full-ended, clearly observable, and objectively measurable. Very often you see in guidance for learning outcomes, they should be observable, they should be objectively measurable, they should be clearly kind of, sort of say, as I say, full-ended. Then there is another theory, you can call it constructivist, but there are also other ways of naming it, which will emphasize the need for learning outcomes to be process-oriented, to be open-ended, more open-ended, I would say, and somewhat limiting the measurability. And I think what we see here is a kind of a tension between what we could call a more strategic, instrumental versus a more communicative, deliberative rationality. And that is important because if we say that learning outcomes should be absolutely measurable, there's no doubt, there should be no kind of room for ambiguity. Well, I think that's a problem because a lot of learning is process. A lot of learning is ambiguous. We need to open up this space for learning. And I think this discussion of this tension is actually quite important, but I cannot go into that now here. So we can move to the next slide. And a key lesson is avoid what we call the dumbing down. Learning outcomes, in our opinion, needs to be defined and written in ways which allows for some local adaptation and interpretation by teachers, but also by learners. Too detailed and prescriptive statements can actually undermine and lead to a dumbing down of the learning and assessment, so that we are limiting the learning process more than it should be done. So let's not, in a way, use learning outcomes in too restrictive a way. It's more opening for active learning, for, let's say, practice-based learning, for kind of releasing the potential of individuals. We shouldn't, in a way, restrict the potential of the learner. So that's an important aspect. You can take the next slide. So these contradictions we need to be aware. So focusing on process, focusing on measurability. Do we open up or enable learning? Do we limit, restrict learning? Do we allow for local individual adaptation? Do we prescribe and control learning? I think these are very important issues to address when we're writing learning outcomes, when we're using learning outcomes supporting the development of education, training, and learning. You can move to the next slide. So, and perhaps that's the final thing in a way, because a shift to learning outcomes is in particularly underlined if we don't align it with assessment. It should be made clear that learning outcomes written as threshold statements do not prevent learners to go beyond these thresholds. We need to find the balance. Well, we use the term like reliability and validity here, but the role, how we address learning outcome statements, our expected learning outcomes, the expectations to learning outcomes in assessment is critical, because if assessment is not aligned to the way we define the qualifications and programs, well, it might be going in a totally different direction. It might assess something totally different. It might stick to the traditional focus on teaching methods teaching the input focus, which I mentioned. So that's important to underline. Then you can move to the next. And that brings me to the end. And what I wanted to then conclude by is to perhaps draw some attention to what is the kind of relevance of this kind of reflection on learning outcomes for qualification framework. I think there is a big relevance to the way we define our level descriptors, how open, how restricted, but also in a way, how good an orientation do these level descriptors give in terms of distinguishing between different levels? Can they be used as a mechanism for calibrating programs, for introducing the kind of consistency between different qualifications? So I think the learning outcomes thinking and the key messages, restrictive, open, process, perhaps clearly result-oriented, are lessons which are important. So perhaps you have already formulated these level descriptors, but when you come to the application at national level and to apply it for defining qualification programs, these issues, in our opinion and our experience, are very important. So learning outcomes is not by default a solution to everything, but it provides us with an instrument and a perspective to refocus and focus stronger on the individual learner and to give orientation to that learner, but also give orientation to the teacher, trainers, and of course the institutions and systems supporting that learner. So that's my input. And of course you can find a lot of this research and this material on our website where you can download it for free, and please do so. So thank you for listening.